Okinawa, June 15, 1945. The morning sun cast long shadows across the makeshift detention camp, its rays filtering through the humid Pacific air thick with the scent of tropical vegetation and the lingering smoke of recent battle. In the distance, the rhythmic crash of waves against coral reefs provided a haunting soundtrack to a scene that would challenge everything both captors and captives believed about war, humanity, and the nature of their enemies. Inside the wire perimeter, a group of 43 Japanese women sat in careful rows, their backs straight despite exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the ground in practiced submission. Most had never seen an American soldier up close. For months, their government had filled their minds with images of barbaric demons who would torture, violate, and murder any Japanese who fell into their hands. Now, as U.S. Marine Guards approached carrying small brown packages, these women prepared for the worst. What happened next would shatter decades of propaganda in a matter of minutes. The summer of 1945 found the Japanese Empire in its death throes. The Battle of Okinawa, which had raged from April through June, represented the bloodiest Pacific campaign of the entire war. For the first time in the conflict, American forces encountered significant numbers of Japanese civilian prisoners, men, women, and children who had been swept up in the military's desperate final stands. Among them were nurses, teachers, factory workers, and volunteers from the Women's National Defense Association, who had been mobilized for everything from caring for wounded soldiers to preparing final defensive positions. These women had lived their entire lives under a totalitarian regime that painted Americans as subhuman monsters. Japanese propaganda films showed American soldiers as savage beasts who delighted in cruelty. The infamous Demon's Den newsreels shown in theaters across Japan since 1941 depicted American troops bayoneting children and burning civilians alive. School children were taught that capture by Americans meant a fate worse than death, that American soldiers wore necklaces made from Japanese ears and collected Japanese skulls as trophies. The concept of surrender was not merely discouraged, it was portrayed as a betrayal of the emperor, the ancestors, and the very essence of what it meant to be Japanese. But on this humid morning in June, as Marine Sergeant Robert McKinnon approached the first row of prisoners with a cardboard box under his arm, the collision between propaganda and reality was about to begin. McKinnon himself carried the weight of similar propaganda. American war posters had depicted the Japanese as buck-toothed, bespectacled subhumans, driven by fanatical devotion to their emperor. Military training films portrayed them as incapable of rational thought, mercy, or normal human emotion. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crystallized these images into a burning desire for revenge that sustained American forces through years of brutal Pacific warfare. The women had been captured 3 days earlier during the final American push toward Shuri Castle. They had expected immediate execution or worse. Instead, they found themselves in a camp with clean latrines, medical attention for their wounds, and regular meals. Simple rice and vegetables, but more food than many had seen in months. The camp had been hastily constructed using salvaged materials and American engineering ingenuity. Canvas tents arranged in orderly rows, a makeshift medical station staffed by Navy corpsmen, and washing facilities that represented luxury beyond imagination for people who had been living in caves and tunnels for weeks. Still, the women remained convinced that this apparent kindness was merely a prelude to unspeakable horrors. Their military indoctrination had prepared them for American psychological warfare, the idea that captors might use false kindness to extract information before delivering the inevitable torture and death. McKinnon, a 22-year-old from Nebraska whose family farmed corn and wheat across the endless prairies, had volunteered for guard duty partially out of curiosity and partially from a growing sense of unease about his own preconceptions. His letters home revealed a young man struggling with the reality of war versus the propaganda that had sustained him through training. Dear Mom, these people don't look like the monsters in the movies. They look scared and tired, just like our own folks would if the situation were reversed. Like most American servicemen, he had been conditioned to view the Japanese as fanatic enemies, incapable of normal human emotion. The military's own psychological warfare had portrayed them as insects, vermin or savage primitives driven by an alien code of honor that Americans could never understand. Yet 3 days of guard duty had shown him women who comforted each other's fears, who shared their meager possessions, who displayed the same maternal instincts toward younger prisoners that his own mother had shown toward neighborhood children. As McKinnon knelt beside the first woman, a middle-aged nurse whose white uniform was stained with dirt and blood, he reached into his box and withdrew 2 items that would prove more powerful than any weapon in breaking down the walls of hatred: a Hershey's chocolate bar and a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The nurse, Tanaka Michiko, later recalled in post-war interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers that she fully expected the American to strike her or worse. She had been taught that American soldiers particularly delighted in humiliating Japanese women, that they viewed Japanese femininity as something to be destroyed and defiled. She had closed her eyes and begun reciting prayers to her ancestors, asking for strength to endure whatever was coming. Instead, she felt something being placed gently in her lap. When she finally dared to look down, she saw objects that seemed to come from another world entirely. Chocolate had been absent from Japanese civilian life since 1943, when the government had redirected all sugar production toward military rations and industrial alcohol. What little chocolate remained was reserved exclusively for kamikaze pilots and submarine crews. Men about to die for the emperor deserved this final taste of sweetness. The few chocolate bars that existed were jealously guarded by military commanders and black market dealers who could demand astronomical prices from desperate families. For a working-class nurse from Nagoya, whose father had been a factory worker and whose mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families, chocolate was as exotic and unattainable as gold. She had tasted it exactly once at age 7, when a wealthy patient's family had given her a small piece as payment for extra care. The memory of that sweetness had sustained her through years of wartime deprivation, becoming almost mythical in her recollection. The cigarettes were equally shocking, but for different reasons. American tobacco was legendary throughout Asia, smooth, flavorful, and packaged with an attention to design that spoke to abundance beyond imagination. While Japanese soldiers may do with harsh, locally grown tobacco wrapped in rough paper that burned unevenly and tasted bitter, these Lucky Strikes came in a perfect white package with crisp lettering and a red circle that seemed to mock the rising sun itself. The packaging alone told a story of industrial capacity that Japanese propagandists had tried to hide from their people. The precise printing, the quality of the paper, the uniformity of the product, these spoke to manufacturing capabilities that dwarfed Japan's increasingly desperate wartime production. Tanaka's hands trembled as she unwrapped the chocolate bar. The paper crinkled with a sound she had almost forgotten, the rustle of abundance, of resources so plentiful that they could be wrapped in paper and given away to enemies. The foil underneath the paper wrapper gleamed like silver in the morning light. In Japan, metal of any kind had been requisitioned for military use since 1942. Families had donated pots, pans, even Buddhist temple bells to be melted down for aircraft production. To see metal used for food packaging was almost incomprehensible. It suggested an economy so robust that precious materials could be used for convenience rather than survival. The Iwa first taste transported her back 20 years, to a childhood before the war, before the shortages, before the propaganda. The sweetness flooded her mouth with memories of festivals and celebrations, of a Japan that had once traded peacefully with the world, and where children could expect small treats on special occasions. But more than nostalgia, the chocolate carried a message that no amount of military briefing could have prepared her for. These Americans, these supposed demons, had enough food that they could afford to give away luxury items to their prisoners. The implications were staggering. If Americans could casually distribute chocolate to enemy prisoners, what did that say about their supply lines, their industrial capacity, their confidence in victory? More disturbing still, what did it say about their character? Demons didn't share sweets with their victims. McKinnon watched as tears began streaming down Tanaka's face. He had expected gratitude, perhaps, or suspicious acceptance. He had not expected this overwhelming emotional response that seemed to crack something fundamental in the woman's composure. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs as she clutched the chocolate bar to her chest. And for a moment, the young Marine saw not an enemy prisoner, but someone's daughter, someone's sister crying over a simple kindness. Around him, other guards were distributing similar gifts to the remaining prisoners, and similar scenes were playing out across the compound. Private First Class Danny Sullivan from Boston watched as a teenage girl stared at her chocolate bar as if it might disappear. Corporal Mike Petrov from Chicago found himself awkwardly patting the shoulder of an elderly woman who had begun, laughing and crying simultaneously upon receiving her cigarettes. The symbolism was not lost on either side. In Japanese military culture, food was power, control, survival itself. Soldiers were taught that sharing food with an enemy was tantamount to treason. Yet here were American guards distributing not just sustenance, but luxury items that represented the deepest abundance. The Japanese military philosophy of endurance through deprivation had shaped every aspect of wartime society. Citizens were told that suffering built character, that hunger strengthened resolve, that doing without luxuries demonstrated devotion to the emperor. American abundance, by contrast, was portrayed as weakness, evidence of a soft, materialistic society that would crumble when faced with Japanese spiritual determination. But the evidence before these women contradicted everything they had been taught. These Americans were clearly well-fed, well-equipped, and confident. Their uniforms were clean, their equipment was modern, and they had enough surplus to share with prisoners. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate, declining civilization. It was the behavior of a society so secure in its abundance that generosity came naturally. Private First Class Jimmy Kowalski from Detroit later wrote to his sister about the experience. "You should have seen their faces, Mary. These women who we were told were fanatic killers started crying like children when we gave them chocolate bars. Makes you think about what we've been told about who the real enemy is. Maybe the real enemy is the people who convinced these women that we were monsters and convinced us that they were monsters too." The transformation was not immediate, but it was profound. Over the following days, the women in the camp began to talk, first in whispers among themselves, then in cautious conversations with the Japanese-American interpreters who had been brought in to facilitate communication, and finally in what could only be described as a collective awakening to the reality of their situation. The interpreters, mostly second-generation Japanese-Americans from California, who had volunteered for military service despite their own families being interned, played a crucial role in this transformation. These Nisei soldiers could bridge not just the language gap, but the cultural gap between the prisoners and their guards. They understood both the shame the women felt at being captured and the confusion they experienced at being treated well. Sergeant Henry Tanaka, no relation to the nurse, whose family had lost their flower shop in Los Angeles when they were sent to Manzanar internment camp, found himself serving as more than just a translator. He became a counselor, helping the women understand that their capture didn't make them traitors, that their survival didn't dishonor their families, and that questioning the propaganda they had been fed was not only acceptable but necessary. Yamamoto Saki, a 24-year-old teacher from Osaka, who had been conscripted to work in a munitions factory before being evacuated to Okinawa, described the experience decades later in interviews with Japanese historians. "The chocolate changed everything, not because it was delicious, though it was, but because it made us realize that everything we had been told was a lie. If they were truly the monsters we believed them to be, why would they waste precious resources on prisoners? Why would they care if we were comfortable or fed? Why would they show us photographs of their own families and speak with such obvious affection about their wives and children?" The chocolate bar became more than food. It became evidence of a different way of organizing society, a different relationship between government and people, a different understanding of human worth. The daily routine that developed around the chocolate distribution revealed these deeper truths. Each morning, after roll call and before work assignments, the women had volunteered to help with laundry and food preparation. Both as a way to contribute and to occupy their minds, there would be what the guards began calling chocolate time. But it was more than just food distribution. It became a daily ceremony of human connection. The guards began to learn the women's names, to remember their preferences. Some preferred milk chocolate, others dark, to notice when someone seemed particularly sad or homesick. The women, in turn, began to show curiosity about their captors' lives. Through the interpreters, they asked about American families, American schools, American customs. They wanted to understand how a society could produce young men who treated enemies with such consideration. The historical record shows that this scene was replicated across dozens of prisoner-of-war camps throughout the Pacific as American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands. Military reports from the summer of 1945 consistently noted the profound psychological impact of what seemed like simple gestures of basic humanity. Colonel James Harrison, commanding officer of the Okinawa detention facilities, wrote in his official report to General MacArthur's headquarters, "The distribution of luxury items to enemy prisoners has proven more effective than interrogation in breaking down resistance and gathering intelligence. These women, who arrived convinced they would be tortured and killed, are now volunteering information about military installations and troop movements. The cost in chocolate bars has been minimal. The intelligence value has been immeasurable. More importantly, these women are beginning to serve as informal ambassadors when new prisoners arrive, convincing them that surrender to American forces does not mean death or dishonor. But the impact went far deeper than military utility. The women in the camp began to organize themselves differently. Instead of the rigid hierarchical structure they had maintained initially, based on age, social class, and proximity to military authority, they began forming relationships based on shared experience and mutual support. They shared not just the chocolate and cigarettes, but stories, fears, and hopes for a future they were beginning to believe might actually exist. The older women, who had initially maintained strict authority over the younger prisoners, began to relax their supervision. They started encouraging questions rather than demanding obedience. When 19-year-old Suzuki Keiko asked why American soldiers seemed so different from what they had been taught, the elder women no longer silenced her with lectures about proper respect for authority. The sound of unwrapping chocolate became a daily ritual, a small ceremony of transformation that marked the distance they had traveled from their former beliefs. Dr. Ruth Benedict, the Columbia University anthropologist who would later write The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, interviewed many of these women as part of her research into Japanese culture for the American Occupation Authorities. Her notes, preserved in the Smithsonian Institution, reveal the profound cognitive dissonance they experienced. Subject reports that the kindness of American guards forced her to question everything she had been taught about honor, duty, and the nature of the enemy. She states that the chocolate tasted like freedom, not just from physical imprisonment, but from mental imprisonment as well. When asked to elaborate, she explained that for the first time in her life, she felt free to doubt what authorities had told her. The guards, too, were changed by these interactions. Many had enlisted with a burning desire for revenge after Pearl Harbor, carrying with them images of surprise attacks and American sailors trapped in burning ships. They had trained to fight an enemy they viewed as fundamentally different from themselves, cruel, fanatical, and inhuman. The reality of caring for frightened, grateful women who wept over candy bars forced them to confront their own propaganda-shaped assumptions. Sergeant McKinnon's letters home during this period reveal his own transformation. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about what Pastor Johnson used to say about loving your enemies. I always thought that was just Sunday school talk, something that sounded nice but didn't apply to real life. But I'm starting to understand what he meant. These women aren't demons or fanatics or any of the things we were told. They're just people who were told lies about us, just like we were told lies about them. When you strip away all the propaganda and the fear, we're all just human beings trying to get through this war and get home to the people we love." By the end of June, the chocolate had become a bridge between two worlds that had been taught to see each other as monsters. The camp's daily routine evolved around these small moments of shared humanity. The chocolate distribution expanded to include other American treats that arrived in care packages from home. Cookies baked by mothers in Iowa, hard candy from grandmothers in Pennsylvania, chewing gum from sisters in California. Each package represented not just food, but a connection to the vast network of American families who were supporting their sons and brothers overseas. The women began to understand that American soldiers were not isolated warriors driven by bloodlust, but young men connected to communities that cared about them. When McKinnon showed them a photograph of his family's farm, endless fields of corn stretching to the horizon, they began to grasp the scale of American agricultural abundance. When Kowalski described his job at the Ford plant before the war, They glimpsed the industrial capacity that was crushing their own military. The cigarettes carried their own symbolism. In Japanese culture, smoking had become associated with masculinity and military service. For women to be offered cigarettes by male enemy soldiers represented a kind of equality that their own society had never granted them. Some of the older women who had never smoked in their lives learned to appreciate tobacco as another symbol of their changing circumstances. More significantly, the quality of American cigarettes revealed truths about the respective war economies. Japanese tobacco had become increasingly harsh and poorly manufactured as the war progressed. The paper was rough, the tobacco was mixed with sawdust and other fillers, and the taste was bitter. American cigarettes, by contrast, were smooth, mild, and clearly made from high-quality materials. Even enemy prisoners were receiving better tobacco than Japanese soldiers. Tanaka Michiko, the nurse who had received the first chocolate bar, began keeping a diary during her internment. Her entries, discovered years later among her family's possessions by her granddaughter, provide insight into the psychological transformation occurring within the camp. Day 12. Today, the tall American guard, we call him Chocolate-san, brought not just chocolate but also small cakes his unit had received from home. His mother had sent them from someplace called Nebraska. He could have kept them for himself and his friends, but he shared them with us. I cannot reconcile this kindness with what we were taught about American cruelty. When I thanked him through the interpreter, he seemed genuinely pleased. This is not the behavior of a demon. Day 18. Yamamoto-san asked me today if I still believe what we were told about the Emperor's divine nature. I could not answer her. If Americans are truly as evil as we were taught, why do they treat us better than our own military treated us? When did I last see a Japanese officer share his food with enlisted men, much less with civilians? When did I last see a Japanese authority figure show genuine concern for the welfare of his subordinates? Day 25. The chocolate has become something sacred to us, not because it is from America, but because it represents the possibility that we were wrong about everything. If we were wrong about Americans, what else were we wrong about? What else have we been told that isn't true? The taste of chocolate has become the taste of doubt, and doubt has become the beginning of wisdom. The transformation was not without resistance. Several women initially refused the gifts, viewing acceptance as a betrayal of their principles, but hunger, loneliness, and the daily evidence of American kindness gradually wore down even the most committed resistance. Watanabe Fumiko, a 45-year-old widow whose husband had died in the Guadalcanal campaign, initially organized a boycott of American gifts among the older women. She argued that accepting food from the enemy dishonored their husband's sacrifice and showed weakness that would be reported back to Japan. For nearly 2 weeks, she and 5 other women refused all offerings, subsisting only on the basic rice rations. But isolation wore on them. As the other women formed friendships with guards and each other, the boycott group found themselves increasingly alone. When Watanabe developed a severe cough from sleeping on the damp ground, it was an American medic who brought her blankets and medicine. When she finally accepted a chocolate bar on her 3rd week in camp, she did so with tears of both gratitude and shame. Gratitude for the kindness, shame for the months of hatred she had harbored based on lies. Her conversion became complete when she learned that the American medic, treating her cough, had lost his own brother at Iwo Jima, that a man who had every reason to hate Japanese people could still show medical compassion to a Japanese woman represented a kind of moral strength that challenged everything she thought she understood about strength and weakness. Army intelligence reports from this period note that the women began providing detailed information about Japanese defensive positions, not under interrogation or torture but voluntarily, as expressions of gratitude for their treatment. They drew maps showing the locations of hidden artillery, warned of booby traps designed to kill American engineers, and provided insights into civilian morale that proved invaluable for post-war planning. But perhaps more significantly, they began to serve as informal ambassadors when new prisoners arrived. As word spread through the Japanese defensive lines that Americans were treating prisoners well, and more importantly, the prisoners were surviving their captivity with dignity intact, surrender rates began to increase dramatically. The chocolate bars were saving lives on both sides of the conflict. Lieutenant Colonel William Bradford, the camp's intelligence officer, noted in his reports, The most effective propaganda we have is not our leaflets or radio broadcasts, but the testimony of prisoners who have experienced American treatment firsthand. When new prisoners arrive expecting torture and receive chocolate instead, the psychological impact is immediate and lasting. They return to their units as living proof that surrender does not mean death or dishonor. The psychological warfare implications were not lost on American commanders. General Douglas MacArthur himself issued orders for the systematic distribution of luxury goods to all Japanese prisoners, noting in his communications with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington that a chocolate bar accomplishes more than 1,000 propaganda leaflets in demonstrating the superiority of the American way of life. These small gestures of humanity are winning the peace even as we fight the war. By August 1945, the sound of unwrapping chocolate had become synonymous with the sound of minds changing, of barriers falling, of enemies becoming something more complex than hatred allowed. The women's letters to their families, when mail service was eventually restored through Red Cross channels, provide another window into their transformation. Initially heavily censored by Japanese authorities who feared the impact of positive reports about American treatment, these letters began to challenge the official narrative about American brutality. Dear Mother, I am safe and well treated. The Americans give us food and medicine. They show us photographs of their families and speak of missing home. They are nothing like what we were told. Please do not believe everything you hear on the radio. The war may end differently than we expected, but perhaps that is not something to fear. To my beloved sister, the enemy soldiers here share their own rations with us when supplies are short. They have taught us English words and we have taught them Japanese phrases. One young man from a place called Kansas showed me pictures of wheat fields that stretch beyond the horizon. They seem to miss home just as we do. I'm beginning to think that all soldiers, regardless of nationality, share the same fundamental desires for peace and return to their loved ones. These letters, intercepted by Japanese military intelligence, caused such concern that several units were issued strict orders prohibiting any communication with families by personnel who had come into contact with Americans. The truth was becoming too dangerous to the war effort. General Korichika Anami, Japan's war minister, wrote in a classified memo to Emperor Hirohito, reports from Okinawa suggest that American treatment of prisoners is undermining morale among both military and civilian personnel. Soldiers are beginning to view capture as preferable to death, which contradicts fundamental principles of Bushido. Immediate action must be taken to control information flow from occupied territories. The chocolate had become a weapon more powerful than any bomb. It was destroying the ideological foundations that made the war possible. As summer turned toward autumn, the women in the camp began to plan for a future they were now confident would exist. They organized classes, teaching each other English words and phrases they had learned from guards. They shared stories about their pre-war lives, dreams that had been suppressed by years of military mobilization and sacrifice. Some began to express curiosity about America itself. What kind of society produced people capable of such generosity toward their enemies? Yamamoto Saki, the former teacher, organized informal lessons using materials provided by the camp's education officer. American geography, American history, American literature, subjects that had been forbidden in Japan since 1941, became topics of intense interest. The women learned about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the idea that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed, rather than divine appointment. These concepts were revolutionary to women who had been taught from birth that the emperor was a living god, whose will was absolute and unquestionable. The idea that American soldiers could criticize their own government, could vote for different leaders, could express dissent without being arrested. These freedoms seemed almost impossible to believe. The guards, meanwhile, began to see their role differently. Instead of merely containing dangerous prisoners, they began to view themselves as ambassadors for American values. They took pride in the camp's conditions, in the health and morale of the women under their care. Some began to study basic Japanese phrases not for interrogation purposes, but simply to communicate more effectively with people they had come to regard as friends. Sergeant McKinnon wrote to his parents, "I think I understand now why we're fighting this war. It's not just to defeat the Japanese military or to avenge Pearl Harbor. It's to show people like these women that there's a different way to live, a way where governments serve people instead of the other way around. Every chocolate bar we share is a seed of democracy. Every conversation we have is a lesson in freedom. When news of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima reached the camp on August 6th, the reaction was complex and heartbreaking. The women understood immediately that the war was effectively over, but they also grasped the terrible implications for their families and friends. The guards found themselves in the awkward position of comforting enemy prisoners who had just learned that their homeland was being devastated by weapons of unimaginable power. It was during this crisis that the true depth of the relationships formed over chocolate bars became apparent. American soldiers shared their own grief and horror at the scale of destruction, while Japanese women comforted guards who were struggling with the moral implications of such overwhelming victory. The camp became a microcosm of what post-war reconciliation might look like. Former enemies united in their shared humanity and their hope for peace. When news of Japan's surrender reached the camp on August 15th, the reaction was complex. While relief was universal, many of the women expressed concern about returning to a Japan that they now viewed with new eyes. They had experienced a different way of living, a different relationship between authority and individual dignity. The prospect of returning to a society based on rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience held little appeal. Tanaka Michiko expressed the common fear. How can we go back to bowing and scraping before petty officials when we have been treated as equals by our former enemies? How can we accept that women have no voice in society when American women write letters to their soldier sons giving advice and expressing opinions? How can we teach our children to obey without question when we have learned the value of doubt? The final chocolate distribution took place on August 20th, 5 days after surrender. This time the gifts came with addresses, American soldiers hoping to maintain correspondence with women who had taught them as much about humanity as they had learned. The ceremony had evolved into something far more significant than the simple sharing of sweets. Guards and prisoners exchanged photographs, addresses, small mementos that would help them remember this unlikely friendship. Some of the women gave the Americans small items they had crafted during their imprisonment. Origami figures made from chocolate wrappers, letters written in careful English expressing gratitude and hope for continued peace. McKinnon received a carefully folded paper crane made by Tanaka Michiko from the silver foil of Hershey's bars. Attached was a note in broken English. This bird flies between our countries carrying hope that chocolate children of America and Japan will never know war. Thank you for teaching me that enemies can become friends through sweetness of heart. Tanaka Michiko's final diary entry from the camp captures the profound transformation that had occurred. Today we received word that we will be repatriated next week. I should be overjoyed to return home, but I find myself filled with sadness. Not sadness about leaving America. I am still a stranger here, but sadness about leaving behind the person I have become. The woman who entered this camp no longer exists. In her place is someone who has tasted not just American chocolate, but American ideals. I do not know if such a person can survive in the Japan that awaits us, but I know I must try to plant the seeds of what I have learned here. The post-war testimonies of these women became crucial evidence in the Allied reconstruction of Japan. Their accounts of American treatment helped convince skeptical Japanese civilians that surrender did not mean enslavement or destruction. More importantly, their stories helped plant the seeds of democratic ideals that would take root in post-war Japanese society. Dr. Benedict's interviews with the former prisoners revealed the lasting impact of their experience. The subjects consistently report that their time in American custody represented a fundamental awakening to possibilities they had never considered. They speak of learning to question authority, to value individual dignity, and to believe in the possibility of peaceful coexistence between former enemies. Most significantly, they describe a transformation in their understanding of what strength means, from rigid obedience to thoughtful independence, from blind loyalty to informed consent. The chocolate bars had accomplished what years of military conflict could not. They had created bridges of understanding between two peoples taught to hate each other. Many of the women went on to become advocates for democratic reform in post-war Japan. They testified before the new diet about their experiences, arguing for women's suffrage, educational reform, and closer ties with the United States. Their voices carried special weight because they could not be dismissed as pro-American collaborators. They were patriotic Japanese women who had simply been shown a different way of organizing society. Yamamoto Saki became a teacher in the new democratic school system, using her experience to help Japanese children understand that former enemies could become friends. Her classroom always kept a bowl of chocolate on the teacher's desk, not for eating but as a reminder of the power of small kindnesses to change the world. She would tell her students, "This chocolate represents the sweetness that is possible when people choose understanding over hatred, when they choose to see the humanity in those who are different from themselves." Her students, born into post-war Japan, grew up with a fundamentally different understanding of America and Americans than their parents' generation. Instead of demons and monsters, they saw the country that had helped rebuild Japan, that had shared its technology and resources, that had chosen partnership over domination. The chocolate had become the foundation of an alliance that would define both nations for generations. Tanaka Michiko returned to nursing, but with a different philosophy about caring for patients. She had learned from American medics that healing required not just medical knowledge, but compassion that transcended social boundaries. Her post-war work with wounded veterans, both Japanese and American, became legendary in medical circles. She established the first integrated medical clinic in post-war Japan, where former enemies worked side by side to heal the wounds of war. The legacy of those chocolate bars extended far beyond the summer of 1945. In the decades that followed, as Japan emerged as a peaceful, democratic nation and America's closest ally in Asia, historians would point to moments like these as crucial turning points in the relationship between the two countries. The women who had been prisoners became living testimonies to the possibility of transformation, redemption, and reconciliation. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories not of American cruelty, but of American generosity. These stories helped create the foundation for the strong alliance that would define U.S.-Japan relations throughout the Cold War and beyond. When American and Japanese forces worked together in peacekeeping missions, when Japanese and American scientists collaborated on technological breakthroughs, when students from both countries studied in each other's universities, they were building on the foundation laid by chocolate bars shared in an Okinawan prison camp. The taste of chocolate had become the taste of a different future, one where former enemies could not only coexist but thrive together as partners in peace and prosperity. Even today, survivors of that summer occasionally gather to share memories and, invariably, chocolate. The ritual continues, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder of humanity's capacity for change. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II, a group of American veterans and Japanese civilians met at the site of the former prison camp on Okinawa. Among them were Robert McKinnon, now in his 80s, and Tanaka Michiko, 85 and still working part-time as a nurse. They shared chocolate bars, Hershey's bars, just like the ones that had changed their lives 6 decades earlier. The ceremony was simple but profound. As they unwrapped the familiar silver foil, both Americans and Japanese reflected on how far they had traveled from that moment when enemies first learned to see each other as human beings. The chocolate still tasted sweet, but now it carried the added flavor of enduring friendship and mutual respect. The story of Japanese women prisoners and American chocolate bars represents something larger than a single wartime encounter. It illuminates the fundamental truth that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, the simple act of recognizing the humanity in one's enemy can plant seeds of peace that outlast any military victory.